Jared Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com, and this is a hands-on preview of the Nikon Z9. That's right, we had the Nikon Z9 here in our hands in the studio for 3 days to run it through its paces. And before I get to everything else, I do want to say that Nikon took a huge risk by bringing me this camera. We all know how I feel about the Nikons of the past couple of years, and for Nikon to reach out to me because they believe that this camera is up to par, it takes a lot of balls for them to reach out to me and say, we want to let you use this camera for multiple days, and they can't tell me what to say. They aren't here while we're recording this. I can say whatever it is that I want to say. So will their gamble pay off? You're gonna find out during this video, and definitely at the very end of this video when I give my full recap. Now, this was a pre-production model that we had in our hands. That means it was pre-production firmware that's not going to ship when the camera ships. There's still work that they need to do. Now, I'm not saying that because we ran into issues. I'm saying that because when I found certain things that I thought could be better, I let them know, and we had a direct line to Japan. It's like, Japan, hello, and they were like, no, they actually had a person here who deals directly with Japan, was taking a lot of notes whenever I or Steven had something to tell them, and they're going directly back to them, and hopefully they tweak the firmware to make whatever it is that we saw better. Now for this preview, I shot all of the stills and Steven shot all of the video. Now he used the Z9 to shoot all of the video. All the B-roll you're gonna see, all of the action shots of me out and about, he used the Z9. The only stuff not shot with the Z9 video-wise is what you're looking at right now because we don't have a Z9 in hand right here, so we are using the Canon EOS R5. So what did I end up shooting with the Z9? Well, we set up to shoot football. We had American football, as in we had a quarterback. We also had some Aussie rule football players out there. We shot a boxer in a boxing gym. That's fast moving action as well as in low light. I shot portraits of a model, and I also got a skater to come out to the skate park so that we could test out this camera's autofocus, how fast it shoots, and everything else in between. So this is going to be a long video. I have a lot of pages of notes. We've got 5 pages of my notes, and normally it's roughly 2 pages for previews, but being that we had a hands-on, we go in depth. We spent 3 days with this. Now let's get to the specs. So first things first, let's talk about the body design and the feel. Now this is 30% smaller and 60 grams lighter than the D6. Not that I ever actually held on to a D6 because Nikon never sent me one and not too many people ended up buying that. But in terms of weight, it's 1,340 grams, which is heavier than the R3 and the A1. Look, this is a pro feeling camera. Even though it's heavier than the others, it's not that much heavier, and it's not just because I work out and have these massive muscles, it just feels like a Nikon. It's professional, it's strong, it's solid, it's what you would expect Nikon to put out, and they get props for making another great feeling body. On top of the camera, you still have an LCD screen up top. Now there's no buttons directly on top of the camera like you have with an R3 or an A1. All the Sonys have buttons all over the top, but here you kind of have the buttons right around where the shutter is, which is a great place for it because where the ISO for the Nikon is, I got so used to doing that I set my Canons and my Sonys the same exact way. I want to be able to activate ISO right from there. So Nikon always gets that right, so you have that button where it needs to be. Now there's no more back LCD screen down at the bottom, but there are still the buttons that are there, though they're not as mappable as I would hope. If there's a button on this camera, I should be able to customize it to whatever I want it to be. So hopefully with firmware upgrades, they allow us to change those buttons at the bottom to be whatever we want them to be. One thing that's back in this camera are backlit buttons. I love having backlit buttons because when I'm shooting concerts, it's nice to be able to actually see what button I'm actually hitting. The Sony A1 does not have that, so it's good that Nikon put that back in. Now there's 3 custom function buttons around the front, so when you're shooting, you could just move your fingers. There's 1, 2, and 3. I still think it's kind of awkward to have those buttons there. If you have smaller hands, it's gonna be harder to reach, but it is cool that you can go ahead and custom set those buttons to just about anything you want it to be. Like for example, if I wanted to shoot silent, then I had a button there that I could hit that I wouldn't accidentally hit. I would have to actually be like, I wanna hit this button to go ahead and do that. And that was good because I went from silent to not silent, and I had that function button right on the front. So if you're used to that with your Z cameras, well, you have an extra button there because now you have 3 of them. Like we saw in the first teaser video for the Z9, you have a 4-axis tilting 2.1 million dot 3.2-inch touchscreen. Now, they're not the first to do this. Other companies have done this like Panasonic and Fuji, but it's nice to see Nikon trying something a little different here. Do I care much about this screen being able to pull out and do what it does? No, I'm not a big fan. It's not a big deal for me, but some people like to get to lower angles, and when they shoot vertical portraits, they like to be able to pull the screen out and do that. I did it while we were shooting skateboarding just so that Steven could get B-roll of it, but I still prefer putting my eye up to the viewfinder at every chance that I can get. I'm sure in some random situations, it's going to be easier to tilt back and do it. It may be, but I will say it's better when it's on the back of the screen and it's not flipped out to the side. Anytime it's flipped out to the side, I have trouble getting my lines straight, but being that it's attached to the back of the camera, it's always going to be straight and not off axis. So that's good. Also, what else is good is when you're shooting vertical, it rotates the metadata so that you can actually see what you're shooting. Canon does the same thing, but with the Nikon, I actually didn't turn that on. Steven turned it on. I didn't realize that you had to turn it on inside of the menu. That should be on just by default. But I will say that Sony needs to get their act together because Sony doesn't give us this option, and this is great because it puts the numbers right in front of your face the right way. But what it doesn't do is allow you to pull the screen down to 90 degrees, so if you hold it above your head, you're stuck at like a 45-degree angle. Sony's the exact same way, but I think you're still better off with all of the different options they give you, and the screen resolution is fantastic. Moving around to the side of the camera, you have all of the ports that you expect that you would have, including a full HDMI port as well as an Ethernet port on the side of the camera. Flipping over to page 2, you have a new single charger. Back in the day, you used to get a double charger because you could put 2 batteries on it. Now it's a single charger, but it will charge up the B batteries, the C batteries, and the D batteries, and you get a new battery with this camera. In terms of battery life, you don't have to worry about running out of battery life when you're shooting stills because these batteries are powerful and massive, and they're going to last quite a long time. One thing that the Z9 doesn't have is a digital hot shoe. It seems like the flagship or almost flagship cameras all have digital hot shoes in them these days. Let me jump in here real quick because I want to show you this image from the Z9 edited with a bunch of different presets that we've created, starting with Zoolander. Zoolander looks pretty good. Then we've got November Rain. I love how that one looks. Mount Airy is more light and airy. It's kind of the hot thing on the streets right now that a lot of people like. Then we jump up to Almost Famous, which gives you the kind of opposite of light and airy. It gives you a little bit of crunch to it, followed by Fifth Element. Now, those are from FroPack 3, but I want to jump into FroPack 2 and go to Matte Black High Contrast. Matte Black High Contrast gives you a great look. Double stuffed Oreos is like, wow, look at how good that works out. Followed by Dorothy, and then we've got Bob Ross for People. I just wanted to show you Bob Ross for People. And then from FroPack 1, being that this was taken in Kensington in Philadelphia, we've got Kensington, and that looks really good. So look, if you're looking to speed up your RAW workflow or give yourself a great starting point, I mean, I just gave you a lot of great starting points with one file. Well, we created 15 all-new custom Lightroom presets that you can check out right now at FroKnowsPhoto.com/FroPack3. While you're over there, you can play with the sliders to see the befores and the afters, and if you decide to pick them up right now, they are currently on sale. Or you could pick up the Triple Play Bundle, which includes all of the presets that you just saw me use and then some, and that's with FroPack 1, 2, and 3, and you can save a lot more. Now, let's get back to the video. Now let's get on to the specs, the main specs that we care about, starting with a 45.7 megapixel stacked BSI sensor that is designed and developed by Nikon. So we don't know who actually made the sensor, but I don't really care who made the sensor, but they made a point to say that it's designed and developed by Nikon. Now this is interesting. Nikon took out the shutter. There is no mechanical shutter inside of this camera. I know I said that pretty slow, but I want you to understand that they took out the mechanical shutter. I do suspect that Canon and Sony will follow suit and get rid of the mechanical shutter as well. Now, does this introduce any major issues? It is possible that this might introduce some issues when it comes to flickering lights when you're shooting concerts or different LEDs, because one thing that Nikon left out of this that the other guys didn't leave out is a variable shutter option where you can dial in like 1/843.29 of a second, which you can match the light flickering of whatever LEDs you're shooting. I actually just did that at a comedy show because the lighting was terrible. It was terrible LEDs, but I could look right through the viewfinder, go into that mode, dial it, and watch the banding disappear. So is that something they could fix with firmware? I certainly hope so, because the fact that it doesn't have it means we might run into some issues with flickering. So there is sort of a shutter in there that doesn't actually act as a shutter. It's called the sensor shield, not a shutter shield, a sensor shield, because it's protecting the sensor. Now check this out. When you turn off the camera, the sensor shield slaps down to protect the sensor from dust or you touching it. That's awesome. And guess what? It's instant. When you turn the camera on, it instantly gets out of the way. I don't know a camera that powers up as fast as this camera. I can certainly tell you that the A1 doesn't power up super fast, and I can tell you that the other cameras do not have a sensor shield. Now, the Canon and the Sony do allow you to have the shutter come down to protect the sensor, but it's slow as molasses, so it's not even worth using. I counted almost 2.5 to 3 seconds for the A1 to, when I turned it off, for the shutter to come down to protect it, and when I turned it on, it was a little quicker for it to get out of the way, but it's not usable for me because when I want to change lenses, I want to turn the camera off, have the sensor shield come down, take the lens off, put a new lens on, turn it back on, and be ready to shoot instantly, and the Nikon does that perfectly well. Nikon says that it's 2.5 times faster than the startup of the Z6 and the Z7, and Steven and I agree that we think it's actually faster than that. So the Z9 is really lightning fast, turning on and turning off. Speaking of lightning, there is a new processor inside of this camera. That's the engine that powers just about everything, and it's called the Xpeed 7. It's replacing the Xpeed 6. There were, I'm pretty sure, dual Xpeed 6 processors in the Z6 II and the Z7 II, and they didn't really do very much because we know that the autofocus wasn't very good there. And in this case, the Xpeed 7 processor is what powers the autofocus and allows this camera to have very good autofocus. That's right. Now, the problem here is that it's called an Xpeed 7. Now, you would think that going from the 6 to the 7, yeah, that makes sense. That's incremental. But the problem is that this processor is a hell of a lot better than what came before it, and Nikon needs to do a better job of marketing it. They should have done something like call it the Xpeed Lightning, because it is lightning quick. Let me give you a lesson on marketing. This is liquid death. This is a can of liquid death. It's water in a can. Is it special? No. It's water in a can. I didn't buy it. They sent it to me, but it's called liquid death. That's kind of good marketing. So Nikon, Xpeed Lightning, call it the freaking Xpeed Lightning. Even Canon did a better job here. They went from their Digic 8 processor to their Digic X, not Digic 10, because X just feels extreme. Because what's X gonna do to you, Steven?
X gonna give it to you.
He's gonna give it to you. At least he used to give it to you. Now back to the Xpeed 7, and I wanna say I'm not ripping on Nikon here. I'm just giving them a pointer because this processor allows this camera, the Z9, to be 1,000,000 times better at autofocus than the Z6 and Z7. That's right, breaking news, this is close to being on par with the top of the line Canon and the top of the line Sony's. I'm not gonna say that it's on par with it just yet because Canon and Sony are further along in their development. They've had more generations to work with, but Nikon has basically caught up and given us something that actually works. What I've been saying for years is I want to use a camera that gives me the ability to capture images that I otherwise would have missed. The Z6 and the Z7 and all of the other Z systems couldn't do it. When you picked up a Canon R5 and R6 and the R3, It can do it. Speaking of those, I am probably one of the only people at this point in the world, there's probably a handful of people that have used an R3, an A1, and a Z9. I'm probably one of the only people to do that. So I have extensive usage here and knowledge of each of those systems to give you the honest and truthful feedback because I've used all of them. And guess what the Nikon finally allows me to do? It allows me to capture images that I otherwise would have missed. It's doing what the Canon and the Sony have allowed us to do for years, and it's what I've been hammering home to all of you Nikon users, that if you've never picked up anything else other than the Nikon mirrorless cameras, you don't know what you've been missing. Now, here's a couple of real-world clips showing you the autofocus in action recorded with my EVF. So this is exactly what my eye sees and what you will see when you put your eye up to a Z9 and shoot in these situations. So now if you pick up a Z9 or hopefully a Z850 or a Z7 III or a Z6 III in the future, you're gonna finally see what I've been talking about. For the fact is, when you can pick up a camera and it finds the eye and you don't have to worry about it, because good enough isn't good enough. And to all the people that have Z6-7s and Z6-2s and you've been waiting for a firmware update to make your autofocus better, it's not coming. It's not a software issue, it's a hardware issue, and that's why the Xpeed 7 Lightning is the way to go, and they got it right here, and they need to trickle it down in future generations. Now, I want to bring up that teaser video that Nikon put out showing you the autofocus working. Now, it looked amazing, and everybody was like, this is gonna eat the lunch of everybody else because look how incredibly sticky it is. And I looked at it, and I couldn't say anything at the time, but our focus didn't look like that. This is an EVF look at what our autofocus looked like. It's not as sticky as what they showed, and the reason is that was digitally generated. Now, the video that they captured was probably from the EVF, but they added that focusing box later in post, and I don't know why. They're not the only company to ever have done that. I'm pretty sure that Sony and Canon both have done that, but they usually tell us when they do it. But I did ask, was that digitally generated, that overlay? And the answer was yes. Now, I don't say that to rip on them because the autofocus did a lot of what it needed to do. For example, 54 shots in a row of this skateboarder coming directly at me with the 70-200 2.8, I believe they're basically all in. It got the guy coming right at me and he's moving really fast, and even when he's out of the frame, it's still in focus. So that's a good thing. The focus is working. The overlay may need to be tweaked a little bit to speed up, but it's still giving you the focused pictures. And it's also 8 trillion times better than where it used to be. Now, speaking of autofocus, there's 493 focusing points. That's 5 times more than the Z7 II. The A1 has 759 and the R3 has 1,053. And I'm starting to question whether this isn't just marketing, how many focusing points it has. The reason I say that is because the Nikon has the least amount of them, and when we were being told how many it had, I was worried that it was gonna be terrible, but after using it in the real world, I don't know that having more focusing points versus less actually mattered, because it tracked subjects, it did exactly what I wanted it to do, and it worked out very well. Now, there were some situations where I ran into some issues. Case in point, I was photographing a boxer and he was laying there doing push-ups off a bench and he had 2 barbells in his hand, and when he would come up, the focus would shift from his face to those barbells or dumbbells. And when he would go back down, it would go back to the face. When he'd come back up, it would shift back to the barbells. It shouldn't do that when you have face detect on. It should always stay locked like glue on the face no matter what. The Canon does that, the Sony does it, and this one didn't seem to do it. Now, that may just be a firmware tweak that I brought up to the Nikon people that were here, so hopefully that's something that they fix. Now, what I will say is that it's easier on the Canon to change between turning IAF or face detect on and off. With a press of a button on the Canon, you can do it. With the Nikon, you can sort of do something to turn it off. Now, this comes in handy where if someone's holding something out and you don't want it to be on their face, but you want it to be on the football or something, that you can turn off the face detect instantly and have it go to the football. The way the Nikon works is you can map another button and you have to press and hold the button to deactivate it. So if you want to use your back thumb to change the shutter speed, well, you kind of have to take it off that back button. So hopefully they can give us the option to turn it off and on with a simple mappable button. Let me jump in here to remind you that the Super Huger Mega Camera giveaway is still going on for 2021, where you can win a chance to get $4,999 of my money to spend on anything you want at Allen's Camera. Now, it's completely free to enter over at bit.ly/megafro2021. If you decide to pick up any of our presets or you already own the presets, you will score extra entries. Once again, you don't need to make a purchase in order to win the grand prize. Now, let's get back to the video. Now, an important thing that I do want to put out there is that 2 years ago, I was trying to decide what camera to take on the campaign trail with me, and it was between the Z7 and an A7 R4. And I chose the A7 R4 simply because of autofocus. The fact that I could just walk backwards or move around and the IAF would go where it needed to go. And what I do want to say right here and right now is if this Z9 existed 2 years ago, I would have taken that camera because I was heavily invested in all of the Nikon glass, and I wouldn't have looked at the Sony because the Nikon would have given me what I needed it to give me. At the time, the Z7 could give you autofocus and iFocus. It just was not consistent. It was very slow. I couldn't trust it. In this case, I can trust the Z9 more than I could have ever trusted any of the other cameras before. So that's a big thing to say there, that if this did exist 2 years ago, I probably would have taken it and I might still be shooting Nikon. Now let's get to page 3 of 5. 3 of 5. Here we go. They've added 3D tracking back to this camera for stills. It's not for video, it's for stills. Though I don't know, this I actually think is a marketing thing because people really loved the 3D tracking. It's kind of the same as the all-encompassing, all the time on AF, except that I now have a box that's active that I can move around. Same with the R3, same with the A1. This is a feature I love. I love having an active box, but I love that the face detect and the IAF always override first, and then I could use this box to tell it where to go if I ever need to tell it where to go. Let's move on to ISO. We have a native range of 64 to 25,600. Now, would you rather have 100 ISO to 51,200, or would you rather have the low of 64? I kind of rather have the low of 64 personally, because if you're going to be doing portraits at 45 megapixels, I like having 64. It's super nice and clean. And you can shoot video at 64 as well, so that's gonna be super nice and clean. Plus, you're not pushing it too far. And to be honest, I pushed this thing to like 16,000 ISO indoor shooting boxing. Perfectly fine, perfectly usable. I was very happy with the ISO capabilities in this camera. In terms of the menu system, it's the same menu system with some tweaks. If you're familiar with Nikon from all the way back in the day, D2H, D1X, all of that stuff, it's basically the same menu. It's gotten a little cleaner, and it added something that's pretty cool. If there was just a toggle to turn something on versus off, you don't actually have to go all the way into that section to hit on or off. You just literally hit the switch while you're live in the menu and it will turn that section on or off quickly. Moving on to the EVF, we have a 3.69 million dot blackout-free EVF at 120 frames per second refresh rate. Now, it's not as high as its competitors. The A1's EVF is absolutely incredible. The R3's EVF is incredible. And the Z9's, even though it's less dots, I didn't notice any issues. And to be honest, I really like the way that Nikon does its auto shifting of the brightness in the EVF. It's more incremental, whereas the Sony is like, it's dark, so I'm gonna make it brighter, or I'm gonna make it darker, and it's a major shift. So I found that my exposures are a little better on the Nikon side because I'm used to, or it just works better, the way that it does the auto brightness of the EVF. Being that you have an electronic shutter and only electronic shutter, it maxes out at 1/32,000th of a second. In the past, with a mechanical shutter, you maxed out at 1/8,000th of a second. Well, you can get 1/32,000th of a second. The R3, just so you know, does 1/64,000th of a second. The reason you would do that is if you had like honestly, if you had the Noctilux lens, the 0.95 from Nikon, the one that doesn't actually autofocus, that weighs a ton and it's chody, yeah, if you had that outside and you wanted to shoot at 0.95, you would go to like 64 ISO, you would set it to 0.95, and you'd probably go to 1/32,000th of a second if it's bright, and maybe you have enough shutter speed to work with. But those are the situations that you use it in. Now I want to come back to autofocus for a second, because Nikon is saying that they do high-speed AF calculations to the tune of 120 frames per second, which matches the A1. Now speaking of frames per second, are we ready to talk about how many frames per second this camera shoots? Let's start off. We've got 20 frames per second raw 14-bit. Lossless compressed. You cannot shoot 20 frames per second uncompressed. In fact, you don't even have an option for 1 frame uncompressed. This camera does not let you shoot uncompressed RAW at all. I don't know why that is the case. I mean, if I want to just shoot 1 frame, why can't you just let me shoot 1 frame uncompressed? Now, there's a lot of people that will say you can't tell the difference between compressed and lossless compressed or uncompressed. They're probably right, but I like having all the uncompressed data when I shoot. One, for when you're processing those images in the computer, it literally needs to unpack every one of those images. And when you're shooting at 20 frames per second and you're moving a lot of data, that's a lot of pressure on the computer. It does slow me down when I'm processing. Is it that big of a deal at the end of the day? The answer is probably no, but probably the only way that they could get you 45 megapixel images at 20 frames per second, the only way they could do that, in my opinion, was to give you 14-bit lossless compressed. On the flip side, the Sony A1 is 20 frames per second at 50 megapixels uncompressed. That's 50 megapixels, 20 frames per second uncompressed. So something's going on there that Sony can do that Nikon can't. Now, in terms of megabytes, the Nikon 45 megapixel image is giving you a compressed RAW file of 60 megabytes. Now, the uncompressed RAW file from the 50 megapixel Sony is 103 megabytes. Yeah, it's a big file. You're pushing a lot of data at 50 megapixels, but there has to be a reason why Sony can do it, but Nikon can't, and I honestly don't know what that is. Is it a deal breaker at the end of the day? The answer is no, but if I can shoot uncompressed, I'm personally going to shoot uncompressed. Now, we all know that the Sony A1 can shoot at 30 frames per second, so can the Z9 do 30 frames per second, Steven?
Yes.
Yeah, it can do 30 frames per second, JPEG. Yeah, it doesn't give you a RAW option to shoot 30 frames per second. So when you go into 30 frames per second mode, you are getting JPEGs only. I'm not too happy about that, but again, a trade-off is 45 megapixels, 20 frames per second. That's not bad at all. On the flip side again, the A1 that does 30 frames per second, it's doing that in compressed RAW, and it's giving you a 50 megabyte file. So I'm not sure why Nikon couldn't use their new high efficiency RAW, which is a more compressed type file, to do 30 frames per second. I don't know if that's a firmware capable upgrade that will allow them to do that in the future, but what's my shirt say, Steven?
I shoot RAW.
It says I shoot RAW. So if I want to shoot RAW, I have to be at 20 frames per second. Hopefully they can change that in the future. The 30 frames per second is cool, but you know what's even cooler than 30 frames per second, Steven?
What?
120 frames per second. Yeah, the Z9 has this mode that I thought was going to be a gimmick until I used it. It shoots 120 frames per second. Now you're getting a 11 megapixel JPEG out of that, but you're shooting 120 frames per second. I tried it and it's pretty interesting. Imagine if you're gonna shoot a baseball player, a batter, trying to hit the ball, and you get the swing, and you're literally dialing through pictures, and you come up with the ball on the bat. That is what 120 frames per second gives you. Or if you're teaching a pitcher, you're teaching a batter, you're teaching sports, to be able to shoot the 120 frames per second and pluck out an actual image because it's a JPEG, you're literally shooting 120 frames per second. It's like shooting slow motion video. It's a pretty cool mode. And I'm gonna show you some samples of that when I get into breaking down the images. Now, I did find an issue when shooting 30 frames per second and 120 frames per second. It's a minor thing, but when I was in silent mode trying to take pictures, there was no notification inside of the viewfinder telling me I was taking pictures, other than the remaining shots, which I could barely see. Now, when you're normally shooting pictures, there is a whitish box that shows up when you take the picture. I would prefer that that was a smaller box that lit up a color like what the Sony does and what the Canon does, but right now it's this white box that blinks when you're taking pictures, especially when you're in silent. The fact that it didn't give me any notification must have been a firmware issue or something that they forgot that hopefully they correct by the time this camera comes out. But you could turn on the sound, which you can actually dial in the different sound and make it louder, make it deeper, whatever you want it to be. I just found the sound to be annoying. Plus, if you're shooting 120 frames per second, it should literally sound like this. Beep! It shouldn't sound like 20 frames per second. Let me jump in here and say that this video is brought to you by Squarespace. Are you one of those people who thinks that Facebook and Instagram is a great place for your portfolio? Well, it's not, because what happens when it crashes? Nobody can get to your portfolio. So use what I use for my own personal website. I use Squarespace. To get your 14-day free trial, head on over to squarespace.com/FroKnowsPhoto. It's easy, it's simple, it's affordable, you don't need to know coding, and if you decide to sign up, use the code FroKnowsPhoto at checkout to get 10% off your first order. Now, let's get back to the video. Moving along, we're getting there, guys. Thank you for staying with us here. We're going up to page 4 of 5. Now, this is interesting. In high efficiency RAW 14-bit compressed, you can do 1,000+ images without running out of buffer. That's 50 seconds of shooting, over 50 seconds of shooting. That's if you're in high efficiency RAW 14-bit compressed. Now, why is this possible? Because you have dual CF Express Type B slots, whereas the A1 has the Type A slots, which is the smaller card. The Type Bs are 2 times faster than those smaller cards. I like the Bs because they're so super fast. It's quicker when you're transferring all of this data to your computer. It's also quicker to get the images out of your buffer and into the cards. So you have 2 of these, which is always great to have. Now, this is something that we wished Canon did. I don't know why the R3 has an SD and 1 CF Express Type B. It should have 2 CF Express Type Bs. Like Count says, 2. In terms of image stabilization, you have 5-axis Ibis up to 6 stops. It's similar to what you find in the Z6 and the Z7. It's good. It's not going to give you gimbal-like video, but it's going to do a pretty good job, especially when you pair it with a lens that has VR built in. Now, here's a really smart feature that Nikon added to the Z9. It's called VR Lock. What it does is it locks the VR. It locks the sensor in place when you turn the camera off, so it's no longer floating there. With the Sonys that have IS or image stabilization, when you turn the camera off, the sensor's like, I'm just gonna lay here, which means it's flipping and flopping around if it's getting jiggled and jangled. If you're in a car, if you're flying, you're in a boat, you're running, you're doing anything, it's not locked. So this is a really smart feature that Nikon included. Now, those are the key specs as it pertains to stills. We're gonna get to video after I go into the computer because I wanna show you sample images and break them down, show you quality, show what worked, show what didn't work. So let's get to that right now. All right, we're starting off with football. I'm shooting with the 400mm VR2. Now, they don't have a Z lens yet. They have a development announcement for a 400 2.8. No idea when that's coming out. But what they did have is an F to Z adapter version 2. It got rid of the lens mount on the bottom, which was a problem. It kind of got in the way when you were trying to hit those extra function buttons. It's now gone. Does it make it focus any better? The answer is no, it focuses exactly the same. They just redesigned how it worked. Now, it worked well with this lens. I'm happy with how sharp this is. It worked out perfectly well there. A couple of action shots. You can see how it tracked. It worked well. It focused. The colors are great. They're Nikon colors. I'm happy with it. Now, if you think that there's some green tint to any of the video or the photos, just look, we're on this AstroTurf that's going to reflect back green, because whatever color the turf is that you're using, it's just going to bounce that light back. It's going to reflect. So if you see any different color tones, it's because of that. But I was happy to be able to just follow the subject, shoot exactly how I wanted to shoot, and honestly have the Nikon lock onto the eye, even if it wasn't perfectly smooth. It was catching, it was staying up with it. It was so much better than trying to use a Z7 or Z6. It worked really well. It's pretty close to the Canon and to the Sony at that point. And just look at it, you see it. Nice and sharp, works extremely well. I'm at 1/10,000th of a second because I wanted to go past that 1/8,000th of a second just to see what would happen. Now, I went to this to use a 50 1.2, and in the past we know that when I tried to use a 50 1.2 at the hemp farm with a subject right in front of me in a Z7, I had trouble. And it wasn't me, it was the camera. And to prove that is that the Z9 got it right. The Z9 doesn't have any issues at 1.2 instantly finding focus on the eye. It doesn't have a problem at all. So I love the separation that I can get, and that I can trust that I'm not standing there looking like a bigger moron than some people think I already am, because the camera does exactly what I needed it to do. Moving on, this is where I want to have a one-click button to turn off the face detect, because I want to be able to focus on this ball with one click, instead of having to go into the menu, find the setting that I need, and then turn it off and have it focus right here. I want to be able to click a button and be able to go from the eye, hit a button, and then boom, get the ball focus and be happy with it. So 14mm right here, I love how close I can get and have it nail the eye. That's all I could ask for, and it gave me everything that I would want from it. The 120 mode, I want to jump into that next. I'm going to keep scrolling because I got to highlight the entire set of images that I took at 120. And yeah, that's a lot of scrolling. Why? Because when I select all of them, that is 458 images. But I'm going to hold my finger down. Watch what it does. Look at this. We're going to follow the ball. There it goes. He's thrown it like 60 yards just without even running. Follow the ball. There it goes. Each one of these is an individual image. We could pluck any image out here, but check this out. You've got the wide receiver catching the ball right there, and now it's gonna come back to the beginning. Wow, that's a lot of pictures. My favorite is when you do this, it's like, there goes the ball, and then you rewind, and you're like, whoop, there it is right there. Now keep in mind, each one of these is 11 megapixels. It's like a 3.5 megabyte file, but for newspaper shooters, for agencies, for people that aren't doing prints, honestly, even if you are doing prints, you're still gonna get a print from an 11 megapixel image. We used to shoot at 4 megapixels with a D2H back in the day. This is more than 8. This is 11. It's not quite 12, but you could pluck this out and it's perfectly usable. To be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if Canon and Sony have some sort of firmware upgrade that allows you to shoot at 120 frames per second, or I wouldn't be surprised if Sony somehow let you do 240 and they squashed it even further. But having those options in there, I thought it was a gimmick, but it worked out really well. So moving on to portraits. Yeah, not only is this a sports camera at 45 megapixels, of course you could shoot weddings and portraits with it. This is at the studio. She was wearing green. The beautiful paint on these floors that are 100 years old or more, or maybe a little less, look good in green and really sharp. This is with the 50-1.2 at 1.2. It nailed it. That's all I want this camera to do, is nail it. Now, I have the adapted 105-1.4, which is one of the only lenses that I think I kept 3. I kept the 300mm f4, I kept the 8 to 15 fisheye, and I kept the 105 1.4 because that is my all-time favorite portrait lens, and being able to finally have it sort of work with IAF was good. Now, I ran into a few situations where when her hair was more in front of her eye, it was having trouble finding her eye. It was bouncing around to the hair, the highlight, it was a little slower to focus. Then when she had a clearer eye without hair in there, it started to find the eye much better. And in this case, it found this eye over here. It's nice and sharp. It's beautiful. The colors and the tones are fantastic there. We went for a walk. I threw on the 51.2 again. I used Kensington, one of our presets, because I kind of had to make it. We're actually in Kensington. That's funny. We use Kensington in Kensington and not London Kensington. This is like Philly Kensington. So it's rough, it's tumble, it's raw. I love how this looks. Great compression, separated from the dirtiness that is Kensington. And then we had some trees. We threw her up against the fence gently. The church in the background. I just want you guys to see the color here. I can't share these files with you because it's a pre-production camera, so I can't share them, but we zoom in. You can see how clean. We have no issues with these files whatsoever. Nice and sharp on the eye with the portrait. Threw on the 85 1.8, which is great for portraits. The 85 1.8 is great for portraits. I just feel that it's a little slower focusing when it comes to the action stuff. I've used it at concerts. You can get the job done with it. I'm not sure how perfect it's going to be for fast moving action, but I recall using it for concerts and it was great. I like their smaller lenses. I think they're nice and light, easy to carry around, a little more expensive than I would hope that they would be, but I'm still not happy that Nikon calls everything the S line and doesn't have like a gold line anymore. They should really come back to that to be the top of the top of the top. Would you like me to send you this free guide to capturing motion in low light situations? Well, if you said yes, just look for this orange box over on my website, put your name, email address in it, hit send it, and I'll send you that guide for free. So after shooting portraits, we then went indoors to shoot a boxer. This one is at 16,000 ISO. Did I need to be at 16,000 ISO? I guess at 1/2500th of a second, the answer is no, but if I want to freeze the action, the answer is yes, from Marv Albert. Let's zoom in 1:1. Yes, you see noise, yes, you see grain. It's not gonna look like this when you print it out. If I was to zoom in 100%, you're looking at blowing this up 4 feet by 6 feet and then get right up in front of it and look at it to see that grain. I'm happy with noise, I'm happy with grain. I would not use any of those noise reduction softwares on this. I think that that's perfectly good looking grain. It's very filmatic. It looks just like what film would look, except we would never be shooting at 16,000 ISO because that film didn't exist. So that is fantastic. Now, being that I was at 1/2500th of a second before, you don't always need to freeze action. You can try and get some movement. And here with the quick bag, whatever they call it, I don't know what it's called, quick bag or whatever, you know that thing's gonna bounce back and forth. So I went to 1/13th of a second handheld with a lens that doesn't have VR in it and was lucky enough to have him perfectly still as you see his arm moving and you see the bag going back and forth. So don't forget that you can get some action shots with movement. Now we're back to 8,000 ISO, shooting at 1/1000th. Love it. Really happy with what I was getting. But what I will tell you is that the autofocus was erratic. It was bouncing around quite a bit. I got the results that I wanted. You just have to figure out how to work with the camera the way that it is. It just seemed to be thrown off by the hand moving in front of the face or his shoulder. If I was shooting tighter, you would be like, oh, why is it on the shoulder and why didn't it stay longer on the face? And there is a setting called erratic if you're shooting erratic subjects. Well, I went to erratic and I went to the highest number on it as what Nikon told me to shoot in, and I didn't expect that the autofocus would stay erratic. I thought that it was for erratic subjects. So that wasn't perfect. That's something they need to work on and tweak, but I still got the results that I wouldn't have gotten in the past. So that is a sign that makes me happy. 12,800, this is the color that you get from that. Still looks good. The raw file is fine. I'm happy because I shot raw because I wasn't shooting at 30 frames per second or 120 frames per second. So the raw files are fantastic. A profile shot is pretty hard to do. At 1.2, it nailed it at 6,400, but again, this was a situation that was much harder for the camera to manage. I didn't feel as confident with the autofocus because it was super erratic as his hands were punching, but I still was able to pluck out images. This one is a little questionable, but we're at 6,400. I think it may be on the mouth. It's darn close. It's darn close. That's nitpicking right there. this is where we showed the example where he was popping up and the focus needs to lock on the face. It just should lock on the face and never be thrown off at all. So that's an option that I'm hoping that they change by the time the camera comes out, or at least tweak it with a firmware upgrade. Now, Canon, on the other side, gives you a ton of different shooting scenarios that they call cases that will stay detected on one subject and not the background. Or if somebody comes in the foreground, it's going to ignore it, and it's going to focus on just that subject. So there's a ton of different cases that Canon offers, so Nikon needs to get on the ball and offer those as well. A couple more here. I just like the way that this photo looked. The black and white is great. I've always loved Nikon black and whites, even at 5,000 ISO. And then this, when I was trying to get the focus on the eye, I'm back at 16,000 ISO, and the fact that the color looks good at 16,000 ISO is a testament to the sensor inside of this camera. So very nice job with those files. Nikon giving us great files. Continuing on, this is something that I love doing to test out the autofocus with a skateboarder. We've got these 54 shots that I'm gonna highlight. We got 54 of them, and we just run through them, and they're all good, right? Even when you get to this point, we can zoom in, and he's still in focus. Even though it doesn't have completely to the edge autofocus, it's close, it still got him in focus here. Look, even that, still in focus, and then back to the beginning. I'll just run you through. That's good. That lens kept up and the autofocus kept up here as well. And then next, we did an even more extreme test with the autofocus using the 14-24. We got Nick skating around this bowl at super duper speeds, and I'm just gonna run through this, hold my finger down and just let it cycle. That is fast. We're at 20 frames per second here. The only time that it missed was right here. And by missed, I mean it focused on his arm, because that was what got closer to the camera instead of it staying longer on the face, which is what I would want. But then by the next picture, it actually switched, nope, it didn't switch right back on the next one. It was two later where it went right back. That's not bad at all. The fact that I could sit there and track him while I was moving and he was moving super fast means that it is really good, and it's coming up to the level of the Canon and Sony. Would you like to show the world that you shoot RAW? Well, you can do that by getting an I Shoot RAW shirt at store.FroKnowsPhoto.com. While you're over there, you can check out all the different swag that we have and show the world that you shoot RAW. A couple of more examples here. I just loved this shot. This is an adapted 8-15 fisheye. Not my favorite lens, but I kept it because no other fisheye existed, and it worked here. I mean, we're at 4.5, and it's fine, right? The colors and the dynamic range, everything looks good. You were able to bring I was able to bring the sky back. That looked great. Action, getting him coming here, tracking him even with this F lens. I mean, we're at 4.5, so it should track him perfectly fine anyway, because even if you miss a little bit at 4.5 and with a fisheye, it should probably be in focus. What do you guys like? Do you like the black and white or the color of these two? Let me know down below. And then we've got another one where 120 frames per second can actually come in handy. So I'm gonna select all of them. And this is where it comes in handy. Like, oh, I want to get the kick flip at a certain point, if that's a kick flip, I don't know. But he's doing some kind of flippy McFlipperson, and he lands it. For anybody who always likes to yell, like, you can't use the photo unless he lands it, he did. But you can go through and pluck out the exact perfect moment that you want. You can't tweak the file as much because it's a JPEG, but you can still do it subtly and get the colors that you want. But it's awesome that you have this 120 frames per second mode for shooting stills. And to wrap up here, I put the 14-24 back on. That tracks really well. It's obviously, you see the difference between the fisheye and the rectilinear lens. Then we get him sitting here. I mean, I love Nikon portraits. The fact that you have 45 megapixels, that you can do action and you can do portraits, this is the perfect wedding camera for professionals. It's the perfect sports camera if you're a Nikon shooter. It is a well-rounded camera any way that you slice it for whatever you want to shoot. I'm happy with the files that I'm getting out of here. And it allows me to focus on shooting and to focus on composition and to focus on not having to worry whether the focus will miss or never acquire, and that I have to worry that I'm missing shots that I otherwise would have got. I'm very happy with those results, and I hope that you guys are happy with what you're seeing here as well. All right, now let's get into the video for the Z9. We can do 8K up to 30 frames per second internally with full pixel readout. Now, Nikon is saying that you can get over 2 hours of record time without overheating. We didn't run into any overheating issues at all, but they also removed the 29:59 record limit. So yeah, so if you can get 2 hours plus without overheating of 8K, that's a pretty good sign. You could do 4K up to 120 frames per second with pixel binning. You've got 4K up to 30 frames per second oversampled from 8K, which is going to give you similar sharpness to the 4K HQ that the Canon R5 gives you, which we're using right here. Steven was extremely happy with shooting this camera when it came to video. The AF was fantastic for him. He said he had no issues with the tracking, with the eye detect. He said it was working out extremely well. He loves the footage, and he was happy with the feel of the camera. For someone who didn't grow up using a Nikon, we did used to use like Z6s to run and gun here. He picked it up and he was really familiar with using it. So it worked out really well, and he was surprised by how nice the footage and the autofocus looked, especially coming from the Z6 and the Z7. Now, what I should say there is that the footage always looked great from the Nikons. It was the questionable autofocus that was more of an issue even when it came to video. It's no longer questionable at all. To piggyback on that, Steven allowed the camera to do the IAF and face detect without telling it where to be, and it nailed it time and time again. Now, there was a new lens that they brought us to use. That was the 24-120 f4Z. That is a great run and gun lens when it comes to video. Steven basically used that the whole time we were out on location because 24 gives you the wide, 120 lets you punch in. That's a great lens for wedding photographers, by the way, because 24-120 basically covers your entire range. Now, it looks like Nikon has caught up with everybody else because all of those video modes are available in 10-bit 422 HEVC. Now, a place they still need to catch up on is giving you the ability to do redundant video recording. You can't record video to both card slots at the same time, but hopefully that's a future firmware upgrade that they will put in there. Now, speaking of future firmware upgrades, we're told that you will get 8K 60 as well as ProRes RAW internal, and they're also going to add waveforms. Now we are up to the final page and the final countdown. We've got GPS as well as Wi-Fi inside of this camera. That's a given at this point. You do have a new menu option for networking in there. It's been reworked. So if you're a network shooter or you're a newspaper shooter and you need to plug into the wire, you can go ahead and do that. But the most shocking part of this camera, other than the fact that the autofocus worked really well, because that's always shocking on a Nikon, is the price. $5499.95. We're not talking about $6,000. We're not talking about $6,500. We're not talking about $7,000. We're talking about $5499.95. That comes in below the R3. The R3 is $5999, and the A1 is $6,500 before you get a $350 grip. So you're at $6,800, right? 6, 7, 8, and 50 is $6,850 for that A1. If you'd like to purchase the Nikon Z9 or any other camera gear for that matter, check out the link down below to Alan's Camera because they are a mom and pop store that's been around since 1977. They helped me get to where I am today, and they can help you get any gear that you'd like to get. So Nikon is serious about this. They want to stop the bleeding. And we're not talking about just a bleeding thing like you cut your finger and you put a Band-Aid on it. We're talking about a gusher here. We're talking about Nikon needed a tourniquet. And they got the tourniquet in the way of this Z9. This, to me, stops the bleeding because this is a loaded, action-packed camera that I was very happy to use. It gave me the results that I was hoping for. It allowed me to capture things that I otherwise would have missed. The problem is, there's already a bunch of pros who jumped ship over the last probably almost 4 years. They've already left. You're not gonna win them back. Nikon is not winning them back with this camera. But maybe they've done enough, and I think they have done enough to keep any pro shooters who are still using Nikon, who are still heavily invested in the big ass glass, they're not gonna jump ship. And they shouldn't jump ship because the Z9 is exactly what they've been waiting for. It's exactly what I've been waiting for, that if it came out 2 years ago, I would have been happy to stay and still use it. That's the past. This is where we're at today. Look, I've loved Nikon. I made a video called A Love Letter to Nikon. I used Nikon since I was 15 years old. I would have stuck around if this camera existed years ago. At this point, I use an A1 for shooting photos, and I use all this Canon gear, the R5 here in the studio for shooting our video. I'm not switching back to Nikon. I already sold all of my Nikon gear. But if this was the camera that was in my bag that I had to shoot with, because that's what I was shooting with, I could absolutely get the job done and be happy to do so. Now, I do put an asterisk on that happy to do so, because I feel out of the three cameras, or the three systems, you got your Canons, your Sonys, and your Nikons, I feel that the Nikon glass just isn't where I want it to be. You can adapt the F lenses, but they don't adapt as well as the EF glass does to the RF mount. With that being said, they do have the Hebrew Trinity. There's a nice selection of lenses right now. Now, they're not revolutionary. They didn't reinvent the wheel like Canon did with the 28-70 f2, and I would like to see Nikon go and do that, because their 51.2 is much larger than Sony's and Canon's. So hopefully they get a little more creative with their lenses, put more motors in them, and get it to focus even faster. Now be sure to stick around after the outro, because I want to run a slideshow of my favorite images from the Z9. Now, there was a lot of talk before the Z9 was announced, though this wasn't coming from Nikon, that this was going to be a camera that surpassed the R3 and the A1 and the competitors. And the truth of the matter is it doesn't. This is not a D3 moment. When the Nikon D3 came out, Sony didn't exist in this market, and yeah, that D3 changed the world, and it's what launched me on YouTube, because I used the D3S when that came out because it let me shoot video. But this was not a D3 moment. What would have been a D3 moment was if this camera came out 2+ years ago and it blew the A9 out of the water at the time. If it did do that, then that would have been a D3 moment. This is a good moment. This is very good. I'm happy that Nikon kind of listened to a lot of the shit that I was giving them for years, and I'm sure a lot of other photographers were giving them, and we're able to turn it around and make the technologies in the Z9 that much better, or a ton better, and now be able to compete and have a 3-horse race and have it between Nikon, Canon, and Sony. So good on you guys for listening. What has to happen next is you have to trickle this down into the cameras that are more affordable to the D850 people who want to spend under $4,000 for that. And then you need your $2,500 version that's going to replace your Z7s and your Z6s and compete with the Sonys and the Canons. And now that they have the technology, I think they're going to be able to do that. It's just, how long will that take? So to wrap this up, let me just say, welcome to the race, Nikon. You've made it back, you put the tourniquet on, you've done a good thing, you took a big risk by putting it in my hands, and I do think that it absolutely paid off. Thank you guys very much for watching. Jared, Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com. See ya.